By day he played ordinary hymns for worship. But at night, he composed special arrangements for special congregations. And for 8 years, no one realized these special compositions carried solidarity directives hidden within the sacred music. Welcome to Silent Legends. Before we unveil the story of a church organist whose keyboard became a weapon against oppression, who turned hymns into coded resistance messages that guided Poland's fight for freedom, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this video today? And if you believe music can carry more than melodies, subscribe to witness stories that time forgot, but history never will. Gdansk, Poland, December 1981. The snow fell silently outside St. Mary's Basilica, one of the largest brick churches in the world, its Gothic spires piercing the grey winter sky like prayers frozen in stone. Inside the ancient walls, the air was thick with incense and the weight of 8 centuries of worship, but also with something new, fear. General Wojciech Jaruzelski had declared martial law just days earlier, crushing the solidarity movement that had given Poland its first taste of freedom in decades. Tanks rolled through the streets of Gdansk, the birthplace of solidarity. Union leaders were arrested in midnight raids. The shipyards where Lech Walesa had led strikes were surrounded by soldiers. The dream of democratic reform seemed dead. But in the organ loft of St. Mary's Basilica, 53-year-old Jan Kowalski continued his work as if nothing had changed. Every morning at precisely 7 a.m., he climbed the narrow stone steps to his domain among the pipes, carrying his worn leather satchel containing sheet music, a thermos of black coffee, and a hope that few understood. Jan had been the church organist for 28 years, since 1953, when Stalin still ruled the Soviet Empire and Poland was firmly under communist control. He was a slight man with calloused fingertips and silver hair that had never quite laid flat, giving him a perpetually wind-blown appearance. His wire-rimmed glasses were held together with tape, and his black coat had been mended so many times it looked like a patchwork quilt. To the thousands of worshippers who attended St. Mary's, Jan was simply part of the church's architecture, as permanent and unremarkable as the stones themselves. He arrived early, stayed late, and filled the vast space with music that made even the most distracted soul pause and listen. Children grew up hearing his hymns, were married to his wedding marches, and buried to his funeral dirges. But Jan Kowalski harbored a secret that would have cost him his life if discovered by the communist authorities. Since 1975, he had been using his position as church organist to coordinate resistance activities throughout northern Poland. His music wasn't just worship, it was warfare. The system had begun almost by accident. In 1975, when the government announced price increases that sparked nationwide protests, Jan had noticed something during Sunday Mass. As he played familiar hymns, certain members of the congregation would nod slightly at specific musical phrases, as if recognizing something beyond the melody. It was Father Henryk Jankowski who first approached Jan with the idea that would transform his life. Father Jankowski, who would later become famous as Lech Walesa's chaplain, had been quietly supporting opposition activities through the church. He recognized that Jan's music reached hundreds of people every week, workers, intellectuals, students, and union organizers who needed a way to communicate safely under government surveillance. Music speaks a language that transcends words, Father Jankowski had told Jan during a late-night conversation in the church vestry. The communists can ban our newspapers, arrest our leaders, and monitor our conversations. But they cannot silence the hymns that have been sung here for 800 years. The priest's proposal was elegant and dangerous. Jan would develop a system of musical codes embedded within traditional hymns. Specific musical phrases, key changes, and rhythmic patterns would carry messages about meeting times, locations, and instructions for resistance activities. To anyone listening casually, it would sound like ordinary church music. But to those who knew the code, every hymn became a lifeline of communication. Jan spent months developing the system, studying mathematical patterns in music theory and creating a complex but learnable code that could transmit detailed information through sacred music. Different hymns carried different types of messages. Te Deum variations indicated meeting locations. Veni Creator arrangements contained timing information. Ave Maria compositions carried warnings about government surveillance or arrests. The beauty of the system was its invisibility. Communist authorities monitored churches, but they focused on sermons and overt political activities. No secret police officer suspected that the gentle organist playing centuries-old hymns was actually broadcasting resistance intelligence to hundreds of listeners every Sunday. By 1980, as the Solidarity movement emerged from the shipyard strikes, Jan's musical network had grown into one of the most sophisticated communication systems in northern Poland. His Sunday performances reached not just the congregation at St. Mary's, but affiliated churches throughout the region where trusted organists had learned his coding system. When workers at the Lenin shipyard went on strike in August 1980, Jan's music helped coordinate support activities across Gdansk. When Solidarity was officially recognized in September 1980, his hymns carried celebration messages that spread through the network faster than any newspaper or radio broadcast. But the declaration of martial law on December 13, 1981, changed everything. Suddenly, the stakes were life and death. The first night of martial law, Jan sat in his organ loft until well past midnight, watching through the church windows as military vehicles patrolled the empty streets. The communist government had moved swiftly and brutally. Solidarity leaders were arrested. Communication systems were shut down. The free press was silenced. Poland felt like a country under foreign occupation. Father Jankowski found Jan there at 2 a.m., still sitting at the organ bench, his hands folded in his lap. "They've arrested most of the union leadership," the priest reported quietly. "Walesa is being held somewhere outside the city. The shipyard is surrounded by tanks. They're calling it a state of war against the nation." Jan nodded slowly. He had expected this moment for months as tensions escalated between Solidarity and the government. "The music network?" he asked. "More important than ever," Father Jankowski replied. "With normal communication cut off, your system may be the only way to coordinate resistance activities. But Jan, the danger is enormous now. If they discover what you're doing." Jan stood and moved to the organ's keyboard. His fingers found the keys in the darkness, playing a soft, mournful version of Bogorodzica, Poland's ancient hymn. But embedded within the familiar melody were subtle variations that any trained listener in his network would recognize as a message: continue operations. Maintain contact. Resist. Within days of martial law's declaration, Jan's musical coding system became a lifeline for the underground resistance. With newspapers banned, radio controlled, and telephone communications monitored, the Sunday hymns at St. Mary's Basilica became one of the most reliable sources of information in Gdansk. The system worked because it exploited the government's own policies. Despite their atheistic ideology, communist authorities allowed church services to continue because banning them entirely would have provoked massive civil unrest. Churches remained among the few places where people could gather legally in groups larger than 3. Jan adapted his coding system for the martial law period, developing new musical phrases that could convey critical information about curfews, safe houses, arrest warrants, and international support. His Sunday morning performance became a briefing session for hundreds of resistance members who appeared to be simply attending Mass. But the most dangerous aspect of Jan's work wasn't the coding itself, it was what happened after the services ended. Beginning in January 1982, Jan began hosting what he called evening prayer sessions in the church. These sessions, held every Tuesday and Friday night, officially focused on musical meditation and prayer. Father Jankowski would announce them during Sunday Mass as opportunities for spiritual reflection through sacred music. But these evening sessions were actually operational meetings for Solidarity's underground network. Under the cover of musical prayer, resistance leaders would gather to receive Jan's coded messages, coordinate activities, and plan operations that would keep the freedom movement alive during Poland's darkest hour. The system was brilliantly concealed. Participants would arrive separately, entering through different doors of the massive church. They would sit scattered throughout the nave, appearing to be individual worshippers seeking solace. Jan would play extended musical meditations, sometimes for 2 hours, during which complex information could be transmitted through his coded compositions. The musical codes themselves had evolved into a sophisticated system that could convey remarkably detailed information. Jan had developed over 200 distinct musical phrases, each with specific meanings. Combinations of phrases could create complex messages about targets, timing, and tactics. Key signatures indicated geographical locations. Tempo changes conveyed urgency levels. Dynamic marking specified the number of people involved in operations. For example, a particular arrangement of Veni Creator Spiritus in D major with specific ornamentations might translate to foreign journalists arriving Tuesday. Safe house location changed to backup site number 3. Government surveillance increased in Port District. Distribute underground newspapers Wednesday evening after curfew. To anyone listening casually, it sounded like beautiful sacred music. To trained members of the resistance network, it was a detailed operational briefing that could coordinate activities across multiple cities. By spring 1982, Jan's network had expanded beyond Gdansk to include organists in Sopot, Gdynia, Warsaw, Krakow, and Wrocław. Each city had trusted church musicians who had learned Jan's coding system and could relay his messages through their own congregations. This created a nationwide communication network that operated entirely through church music. The effectiveness of the system became clear during the massive demonstrations of May 1982. When the government banned all public gatherings to prevent May Day protests, Solidarity organizers used Jan's musical network to coordinate alternative demonstration tactics. Instead of large gatherings that could be easily suppressed, thousands of people participated in synchronized prayer walks through Polish cities, gathering at churches where organists played specific coded hymns that guided the peaceful protests. The success of these demonstrations terrified the communist authorities, who realized that their opponents were coordinating sophisticated resistance activities despite martial law restrictions. But they couldn't identify how the coordination was happening. Secret police attended church services, monitored phone calls, and infiltrated suspected resistance groups, but they found no evidence of the communication system that was operating right in front of them every Sunday. Captain Stanislav Kowalczyk of the Security Service, SB, had been tasked with identifying and dismantling resistance communication networks in Gdansk. A methodical man with 15 years of experience in counterintelligence, Kowalczyk understood that Solidarity's continued ability to coordinate activities indicated sophisticated communication systems that had survived the martial law crackdown. By autumn 1982, Kowalczyk had identified what he called the church problem. Despite intensive surveillance of known resistance members, underground activities continued to be coordinated with remarkable precision. The timing and locations of resistance activities suggested advanced planning and communication that should have been impossible under martial law conditions. Statistical analysis of resistance activities revealed a pattern that troubled Kowalczyk. Major operations almost always occurred within 48 hours of Sunday church services. This correlation was too strong to be coincidental, suggesting that information was being transmitted during religious gatherings. Kowalczyk began placing undercover agents in churches throughout Gdansk, focusing particularly on St. Mary's Basilica, which had become associated with Solidarity activities through Father Jankowski's known sympathies. But the agents reported nothing suspicious, just ordinary church services with sermons focused on faith and comfort during difficult times. The breakthrough came in November 1982, when one of Kowalczyk's agents, a young officer named Lieutenant Tomasz Zalsinski, attended several evening prayer sessions at St. Mary's. Zalsinski had musical training from his youth and was assigned to monitor these sessions specifically because they involved extended musical performances. After attending 6 evening sessions over 3 weeks, Zalsinski reported something unusual to Kowalczyk. The organist's musical selections seemed to follow specific patterns that didn't match any standard liturgical requirements. More puzzling, certain members of the audience appeared to be taking notes during the musical performances, behavior that seemed odd for prayer sessions. Kowalczyk decided to investigate personally. On the evening of November 30, 1982, he attended one of Jan's evening prayer sessions, positioning himself in the back of the church where he could observe both the organist and the audience. What Kowalczyk witnessed over the following 2 hours convinced him that he had discovered something significant. The audience wasn't behaving like typical worshippers. People arrived and departed according to what seemed like predetermined schedules. Many appeared to be listening with unusual intensity to specific musical passages. Most tellingly, several participants left immediately after particular musical phrases, as if they had received the information they came for. But Kowalczyk couldn't understand what information was being transmitted. To his ears, the music sounded like traditional church hymns, beautifully performed but completely ordinary. If there was a code embedded in the music, it was too sophisticated for him to detect. Kowalczyk spent the following week recruiting a musicologist from the University of Gdansk to help analyze recordings of Jan's performances. Professor Maria Nowak, who had studied Polish church music for 20 years, agreed to review audio recordings that Kowalczyk had obtained through surveillance equipment. Professor Nowak's analysis revealed what Kowalczyk had suspected: Jan's performances contained musical variations that deviated from standard hymn arrangements in systematic ways. These variations followed mathematical patterns that suggested they were intentional modifications rather than artistic interpretations. "These aren't random embellishments," Professor Nowak explained to Kowalczyk during a confidential meeting. "The organist is systematically altering traditional hymns according to some kind of pattern. The modifications are subtle but consistent, suggesting they serve a specific purpose beyond musical expression." Armed with this evidence, Kowalczyk prepared to arrest Jan and shut down what he believed was a major resistance communication network. But he made a critical error in timing. On December 10, 1982, Kowalczyk planned to arrest Jan immediately after the evening prayer session, when he would be alone in the church and isolated from potential witnesses. The plan was to conduct a surprise arrest that would prevent Jan from warning other network members or destroying evidence. But Kowalczyk underestimated the sophistication of Jan's security measures. The organist had long ago established protocols for detecting surveillance and protecting the network in case of discovery. These protocols included a system of lookouts who monitored the church for unusual activity and coded musical warnings that could alert the network to immediate danger. On the evening of December 10, Jan noticed several unfamiliar faces in the church, including two men who exhibited the careful observation patterns typical of security agents. More importantly, one of his trusted lookouts had spotted surveillance equipment being installed near the church earlier that day. Following his security protocols, Jan modified his evening musical program to include emergency warning codes. Instead of routine operational messages, his music carried urgent instructions: discontinue all network activities, destroy any compromising materials, assume communications are compromised, activate contingency protocols. The warning codes were embedded in a haunting performance of Lux Aeterna, a funeral mass that network members understood to mean temporary death of the communication system. As Jan played the final notes, participants quietly departed through various exits, following predetermined escape routes that avoided police surveillance points. By the time Kowalczyk's agents moved to arrest Jan at the conclusion of the evening session, the church was empty except for the organist, who was calmly packing his sheet music as if concluding an ordinary prayer service. Jan's arrest was conducted with bureaucratic efficiency. He offered no resistance as security agents escorted him from St. Mary's Basilica to the Provincial Security Service headquarters, a gray concrete building that had become synonymous with political repression during martial law. The interrogation began immediately. Kowalczyk, determined to break what he believed was a major resistance network, employed psychological pressure techniques designed to force confessions from political prisoners. The interrogation room was deliberately stark: bare concrete walls, harsh fluorescent lighting, a metal table, and 2 chairs. Jan Kowalski, Kowalczyk began, reading from a thick file. Age 53. Church organist for 28 years. No wife, no children. Parents deceased. Sister living in Chicago since 1968. He looked up from the file. A lonely man who found purpose by betraying his country. Jan sat silently, his hands folded in his lap, his expression calm. He had spent months preparing mentally for this possibility, following guidance from resistance leaders about how to withstand interrogation while protecting the network. "We know about your musical codes," Kowalczyk continued. "We have recordings of your performances. We have expert analysis confirming that you've been embedding coded messages in church hymns. We have photographic evidence of resistance members attending your so-called prayer sessions." Jan remained silent. Kowalczyk changed tactics. "We also know about your network of organists in other cities. We have their names. We know about the foreign journalists you've been helping. We know about the underground printing operation you've been coordinating." Still silence. The interrogation continued for 6 hours. Kowalczyk alternated between aggressive accusations and offers of leniency, between threats of long imprisonment and promises of reduced sentences for cooperation. Jan answered no questions, confirmed no allegations, and provided no information about resistance activities. But Kowalski made a crucial mistake. In his frustration, he revealed the extent of the government's surveillance capabilities, inadvertently confirming to Jan which aspects of the network had been discovered and which remained secret. This information, while dangerous to Jan personally, was invaluable for protecting other network members. Jan learned that the government had discovered the musical coding system but had not identified most of the participants. They had recordings of the evening sessions but had not decoded the specific meanings of the musical phrases. Most importantly, they had not identified the broader network of organists in other cities. After the first interrogation session, Jan was returned to a holding cell where he spent the night planning how to protect the network even from imprisonment. The next morning, he was brought back for continued questioning. Captain Kowalski had prepared a new strategy. Instead of aggressive interrogation, he attempted to appeal to Jan's sense of patriotism and religious duty. "Mr. Kowalski," Kowalski began in a more measured tone, "I want you to understand that we're not your enemies. We're trying to protect Poland from foreign manipulation and internal chaos. The Solidarity movement has been infiltrated by Western intelligence services who want to destabilize our country." Jan continued his silence, but Kowalski noticed subtle reactions that suggested the organist was listening. "You're a religious man," Kowalski continued. "You've devoted your life to serving God through music. Don't you see that political resistance activities violate your religious obligations? The Church teaches obedience to legitimate authority." For the first time, Jan spoke. "The Church teaches resistance to evil," he said quietly. It was the only statement Jan made during 3 days of interrogation. But those 6 words confirmed to Kowalski that he had indeed discovered a resistance communication network and that Jan Kowalski was its central coordinator. Meanwhile, Jan's arrest had triggered the network's contingency protocols. Father Jankowski, following predetermined plans, contacted trusted allies in the Catholic hierarchy to seek protection for Jan and other network members. The priest also activated international pressure campaigns, reaching out to Catholic organizations in Western Europe and the United States to publicize Jan's detention. More importantly, the network itself had quickly adapted to Jan's absence. Other organists throughout Poland began coordinating among themselves, maintaining the communication system while developing new coding methods that would be more difficult for security services to detect. The international pressure proved crucial. Within a week of Jan's arrest, Catholic organizations in France, Germany, and the United States began publicizing his case as an example of religious persecution under martial law. The Polish government, already facing international sanctions and diplomatic isolation, could not afford additional negative publicity over the arrest of a church organist. After 10 days of detention, during which Jan provided no useful information to his interrogators, the authorities decided to release him rather than create a martyred symbol of religious persecution. But the release came with conditions designed to neutralize his effectiveness as a resistance coordinator. Jan's release from detention came with severe restrictions that fundamentally changed his life and work. Under the terms of his conditional freedom, he was prohibited from leaving Gdansk without permission, required to report weekly to security authorities, and banned from participating in any gatherings larger than immediate family. Most critically for the resistance network, Jan was forbidden from playing organ during any church services except Sunday morning Mass, and then only standard liturgical hymns from approved songbooks. Security agents would attend every performance to ensure compliance with these restrictions. The conditions were designed to destroy the musical communication network by removing Jan's ability to transmit coded messages. But the authorities underestimated both Jan's resourcefulness and the network's ability to adapt. Within weeks of his release, Jan had developed a new system that operated within the strict limitations imposed by his conditional freedom. Unable to modify existing hymns or compose new arrangements, he instead began using his selection and sequencing of approved hymns to carry coded information. The system was even more subtle than before. Different combinations of standard hymns, played in specific orders, could convey complex messages. The timing between hymns carried meaning. Even the specific verses selected from longer compositions could indicate different types of information. For example, playing Te Deum, followed immediately by Veni Creator, and concluding with the first 3 verses of Ave Maria, might indicate international delegation arriving next week. Prepare documentation materials. Maintain low profile during visit. But the most significant adaptation was the network's evolution beyond dependence on Jan's direct coordination. During his detention, other organists had assumed leadership roles and developed autonomous coding systems for their own regions. What had begun as a centralized network coordinated from St. Mary's Basilica had evolved into a decentralized system of independent cells that could operate without central direction. Jan's role shifted from active coordinator to elder advisor. Through carefully disguised encounters, conversations after Sunday Mass, chance meetings in public spaces, messages passed through intermediaries, he continued to provide guidance to the network while maintaining plausible deniability about resistance activities. The new system proved more resilient than the original. When security services arrested other suspected resistance members, the decentralized network could continue operating without significant disruption. When new surveillance measures were implemented, the distributed system could quickly adapt new countermeasures. By 1984, as international pressure on the Polish government intensified and economic problems mounted, the musical resistance network had evolved into something unprecedented, a nationwide communication system operating entirely through church music that connected underground solidarity cells across Poland. The network's effectiveness became clear during the wave of protests that began in 1984. Despite continued martial law restrictions, resistance activities were coordinated with remarkable precision across multiple cities. The government's inability to stop these coordinations, despite knowing that church music was somehow involved, demonstrated the sophistication of the system Jan had created. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the network was its impact on Polish cultural life during the martial law period. As more organists learned and adapted the coding system, church music throughout Poland began carrying subtle messages of hope, resistance, and solidarity. Sunday Mass became not just a religious observance but a weekly affirmation of national identity and democratic aspirations. The musical resistance network's most significant operation began in early 1986, as the communist government attempted to solidify its control through a new wave of repression targeting remaining Solidarity leaders. The authorities had identified several underground printing operations and were planning coordinated raids designed to decapitate the resistance movement. But the government's plans were discovered by sympathizers within the security apparatus who managed to pass warnings to the resistance network. The challenge was communicating these warnings quickly and safely to underground cells across Poland without using conventional communication methods that were under surveillance. Jan, working with organists in Warsaw, Krakow, Wrocław, and other major cities, coordinated the network's most ambitious operation, a nationwide alert system activated entirely through church music during the first weekend of March 1986. The plan required precise timing and coordination. On Saturday evening, March 1, organists throughout Poland would include specific warning codes in their musical performances during evening services. These codes would alert local resistance members to immediate danger and activate predetermined emergency protocols. The operation began at St. Mary's Basilica, where Jan played what appeared to be a routine evening meditation but actually contained urgent warning messages encoded within traditional Lenten hymns. The warnings were transmitted through the network like musical telegrams. Massive raids planned. Secure all materials. Activate dispersal protocols. Assume all safe houses compromised. Within hours, the coded warnings had reached resistance cells in dozens of Polish cities. Underground printing operations were quickly relocated. Important documents were secured or destroyed. Key personnel went into hiding. Safe houses were abandoned and alternative accommodations activated. The government's raids, launched on March 3, found almost nothing. Printing equipment had vanished. Documents had been secured. Personnel had disappeared. What should have been a devastating blow to the resistance instead captured only empty buildings and obsolete equipment. The failure of the raids convinced government officials that the resistance possessed sophisticated intelligence capabilities that somehow operated faster than their own communication systems. Security services intensified their efforts to identify and destroy the resistance communication network, but they continued to focus on conventional methods, radio transmissions, printed materials, courier networks, while the musical system operated invisibly. The success of the March 1986 operation marked the network's evolution into something unprecedented in resistance movements, a communication system that was simultaneously completely public and completely secret. Every Sunday, thousands of Poles listened to coded resistance messages broadcast openly in churches throughout the country, yet the system remained undetectable to authorities who knew it existed but could not crack its methods. By 1987, political changes within the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev were creating new pressures on the Polish government to negotiate with the opposition. The economic crisis had worsened, international sanctions were taking their toll, and the resistance had proven impossible to eliminate despite years of martial law. In this changing environment, the Musical Resistance Network began shifting its focus from underground coordination to preparation for legal political activity. Instead of transmitting information about clandestine operations, the coded messages increasingly carried instructions about organizing for potential negotiations, democratic elections, and legal political participation. Jan's role evolved once again. No longer the coordinator of underground resistance, he became something like a musical historian, preserving the methods and memories of the network for future generations. He began documenting the complete coding system, not for operational use but to ensure that the story of musical resistance could someday be told. The network had accomplished something remarkable. It had helped keep the Solidarity movement alive during its darkest period, providing the communication infrastructure that enabled resistance activities to continue despite martial law. When negotiations between the government and opposition finally began in 1988, the underground network that had been coordinated through church music was ready to transform into a legal political movement. When communism finally fell in 1989 and Poland became a free country, the full scope of the Musical Resistance Network was gradually revealed. Government archives open to researchers showed that security services had known about the coded music system but had never successfully penetrated it. Church records documented the hundreds of organists who had participated in the network. Personal testimonies from former resistance members revealed the crucial role that musical communication had played in coordinating opposition activities. Jan Kowalski was officially honored by the new democratic government for his role in the resistance, but he accepted recognition reluctantly. He had never sought fame or political position, only the restoration of his country's freedom. He continued playing organ at St. Mary's Basilica until his retirement in 1995, but now his music carried only traditional religious messages, no longer needed as a tool of resistance. In 2008, 27 years after the declaration of martial law, Jan's grandson Pyotr was helping clean his grandfather's apartment when he discovered a remarkable archive hidden behind a false wall in the bedroom. Hundreds of musical scores, all appearing to be standard hymns but actually containing the complete documentation of the resistance coding system. Each score was annotated with detailed explanations of the musical codes, examples of messages that had been transmitted, and historical context about the operations they had supported. Together, they represented a complete record of how church music had been transformed into a weapon against tyranny. Pyotr, a musician himself, could immediately recognize the sophistication of what his grandfather had created. The coding system was mathematically elegant, musically beautiful, and operationally brilliant. It had enabled thousands of people to communicate safely during the darkest period of Polish history, and it had done so using nothing more than traditional hymns that had been sung in Polish churches for centuries. The discovery led to academic research that revealed the full scope of the Musical Resistance Network. Historians found evidence of coded musical communications in over 200 Polish churches. Musicologists identified systematic patterns in church music from the martial law period that confirmed the widespread use of musical codes. Political scientists recognized the network as one of the most innovative resistance communication systems in modern history. But perhaps the most moving discovery was a letter Jan had written to be opened only after his death. The letter, found with the musical archives, explained his motivations and methodology in his own words. Music has always been the language of the soul, but during martial law it became the language of freedom. When they silenced our newspapers, banned our gatherings, and imprisoned our leaders, we found that they could not silence the hymns that had sustained our people for generations. Through music, we kept alive not just our resistance, but our hope. Through coded melodies, we proved that the human spirit cannot be imprisoned, no matter how powerful the oppression. I pray that future generations will never need to use music as we did, but if they do, may they remember that freedom finds a way to sing, even in the darkest times. Today, St. Mary's Basilica in Gdansk houses a small memorial to the Musical Resistance Network. Visitors can see examples of the coded musical scores and learn about the organists who risked everything to keep communication alive during martial law. But the memorial's most powerful element is simple: every Sunday, the church organ plays the same hymns that once carried coded messages of resistance, now restored to their original purpose of bringing comfort and hope to worshippers. Have you ever discovered that someone you thought you knew had lived an entirely secret life dedicated to fighting injustice? That the gentle person who made music had actually been orchestrating resistance against tyranny? Sometimes the most powerful weapons against oppression are not guns or bombs, but the quiet courage of ordinary people who find extraordinary ways to serve freedom. Share their stories in the comments. Because legends like Jan Kowalski remind us that resistance takes many forms, that hope can be hidden in plain sight, and that sometimes the most beautiful music is composed not just for God, but for liberty. Thank you for watching Silent Legends. If this story moved you, subscribe and help us honor those who were never meant to be forgotten. Because sometimes the most important messages are carried not by shouting, but by singing, by people who understand that freedom's voice can never truly be silenced.